without friends of mine knowing the way in which my father passed away, had them tell me that my father went to hell. And to be a young person and to experience, my father committed suicide, right? So to experience friends who didn't know that saying that my dad went to hell is like, whoa, like how do I digest that, And so it's like my experiences when I was young and was trying to figure out life in general, that kind of took me away from feeling connected to it, because I can't agree with that, especially now at 28, after having many years to try to dissect and understand what happened with my father and how that happened. My father was going to lose his job. He had slipped a disc in his back. He knew that if he were to pass away, that all his money went to me and my family. And that money was the money that kept us afloat when we would have drowned otherwise. He also knew that my mom is a phenomenal person and was never going to leave me. So I can't sit back on that experience. I also look at the person that it ultimately built, and I can't sit back on that experience and say that was the worst thing you could do, Granted, I would have loved to have my father growing up. I would have loved to have him here today listening to my podcast, right? But the things that came from it have been so beautiful and so good that I can't take on a negative interpretation about it. And that was given to me as a young person, and that hurt my spirituality,
And see,
that's so thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, and like you saying, like, thank you for sharing that. Like, there's power when people take the time to listen
and learn,
because they just hear automatic, suicide, hell.
Yeah.
No, and it's like there's layers to a person in their story. There's layers to where people come from, and at times, going back to what I said, like especially looking at like this article, all of it was related in some form of power and some form of control. And like, these are my own personal opinion when it comes to spirituality. If you are a person who believes, because I think it's also important for us to have the conversation, not just in the Christian context, but in the context of how a person connects spiritually. Because I know I grew up in a traditional Christian household, and my great grandfather was a pastor, but my parents per se were not like traditional Christian church going people. My grandmother was, my cousins were, all that. But my mom and my dad always emphasized your relationship with God is something that you discover for yourself.
Yes.
So
I wish people encourage that more.
And so I didn't get baptized until I was 21 through the encouragement of my grandmother. God rest her beautiful soul. And then after I was baptized, immediately I went to Singapore, and I lived in Singapore for 6 months. And then in Singapore, I was around people who practice Islam. And at that time, that was my first time practicing Ramadan. And I had two friends, and Sohel and Mansour, shout out to them. We practiced Ramadan, and afterwards, at the when the sun would go down, we go have our dinner, we break bread, and we would have these conversations about our own spiritual walk, like me listening to where they were coming from, them listening to me about where I was coming from. And it wasn't about like you're right or you're wrong. It was more so just understanding and respecting. So I apologize for those people that got at you like that, because they weren't listening to you. They were trying to just tell you something from their own narrow perspective. And I feel like that can be said across any type of religion.
I'm glad that's a great segue, because the part that I was going